Welcome back to our exciting lecture series on the history of American literature. Today we are going to be looking at regionalism. And the reason that you see a little umbrella here is because regionalism is actually still part of the realism era. It's just a subset of it, and we call it regionalism and naturalism because we have dual forces going on here. We're going to look roughly at the time period of 1880 to just across the century into 1910. The country is growing, it's an exciting place to be, and we start to see the massive diversity that our country can offer. We start to see lifestyles differ depending upon the part of the country that we live in. And this diversity and this realization of it really started after the Civil War. You see, during the Civil War, we had a lot of soldiers traveling all over to parts of the country that they would probably never have been to if it hadn't been for the war. So we have gentlemen from Wisconsin and Montana and even California and Nebraska headed down south or over to the eastern part of the country and fighting in the trenches next to boys from all over the country. They started to talk about the kinds of food their mamas made and the kinds of ways that they would celebrate big events like weddings and Christmas. And they started to look at the types of clothes that they would wear and talk about the climate differences. And people started to really realize that we had a huge country that was very, very much diverse. Now, in a negative way, the war certainly influenced the division in our country. But in a very positive way, the war helped us to start to celebrate our differences and to say, wow, we were able to overcome these differences, and now let's embrace our diversity and join together to rebuild the nation that was really ripped apart during the Civil War. Now, one of the ways that this happened, one of the ways that we connected each other was through literature. Now, with the westward expansion, the growth of the United States, regional types of writing helped to connect people from all different parts of the country. You have Aunt Mabel, who perhaps is over here in Maine, and she gets on a wagon train and she travels across the country all the way over to California or Utah or Idaho, and we start to realize that Aunt Mabel's lifestyle in California or on the Nebraska prairie is very different than what her life was like in Maine or Boston or wherever she was from. And we probably don't have a really great way to communicate with Aunt Mabel. We can't pick up the phone or check the internet or any of those things to see, hey, I wonder what the weather's like in Nebraska, or I wonder what people are doing right now there. So what regionalism writers did was they helped to connect us by writing stories, by writing newspaper articles that helped us to understand how very different we were, but yet how we were still able to maintain a sense of unity across the country. As regionalism writing grew, so also did our realization that we didn't always talk the same depending upon where we came from. We had unique characteristics, and one way that we did that was through our speech patterns. We had specific dialects. Mark Twain alone in Huckleberry Finn highlights something like 26 different dialects as he travels from Missouri all the way down the Mississippi towards the Gulf of Mexico. And we start to see that depending upon where you come from, you might not only say different words, use different words for things, but your speech is going to sound different. And people like Mark Twain really brought that out. Of course, what it does for us today is make it a little bit difficult to read that kind of writing. It's what makes pieces like Huck Finn so challenging, because we have to sort of try to discern what that dialect is supposed to sound like. So let's start with what we know. And don't you know? Because that's the kind of speech patterns that we're going to hear up in our part of the country. And you know, we talk like this and we don't think we have an accent, but we really do. We can look at the people up in Maine. And one of the speech patterns that you will see even today up in Maine is they might say something like, yeah, the crops are going to grow nice. Yep, yep. And the Maine and the East Coasters would have their own, the New Englanders would have their own unique speech patterns. For instance, if you're from Boston, you might go down the harbor. We also have some different types of word usage. You probably, if you're from one part of Wisconsin as opposed to another part of Wisconsin, you might say soda instead of pop. If you're like me and you come from a little bit farther south, we called everything Coke. When I moved up here from Missouri as a child, I would go to the store or to a McDonald's and I'd say, I'd like an orange Coke. And they would look at me like I was crazy because that didn't really make sense. But we were used everything that was soda or everything that was pop, we simply called Coke. So we noticed that some weird differences going on here. And then, of course, there's the very famous Southern, y'all come back now, you hear? And we have that Southern dialect down there. People talking so fast and so funny we don't often understand. Along with the different dialects, we also have recognizable character types. And there's one particular author who we're going to point out in a minute by the name of Bret Harte, who really created almost all of these in such a way that they were caricatures really from the moment that he created them. But we have starting to see some very recognizable character types in literature. We have the Western miner, the prospector that's out in California trying to strike it rich. We have the cowboy and the saloon girl. The saloon girl oftentimes has a heart of gold. She might be a prostitute. She might be a rough living gal, but she sure does have a heart of gold. We have the New England farmer, yep, up there milking the cows. And we have the Southern country bumpkin who don't know a whole lot about nothing. We find a lot of these character types and a lot of these speech patterns in something we call local color writing. And some authors during this time period would focus some of their stories, make them very specific. Not only would it be set in the South, but it would be set in the Louisiana South as opposed to the Floridian South. And the Louisiana South is going to have very distinct speech patterns and customs. We have a lot of French influence, a lot of Cajun influence. That's going to be very different than the area of Florida and what kinds of things people did there. So local color writing is even more specialized than regional writing, and it focuses even more specifically, magnifies speech patterns, dialects, customs, and character types, and it is supposed to be, as again, we're talking about realism here, under that umbrella of realism, it's supposed to be a realistic portrayal. This is how people really talked. This is what they really did. We began to become very interested in the diversity, as I said before, of our country. Now, one of the things we see with local color writing, which isn't necessarily representative of that whole realism, portray things the way that they are, sometimes local colorists, as you might become when you're talking about home after you've moved away from it, you might become a little sentimental. And local color writers sometimes can be a little bit sentimental, a little bit schmaltzy, and we do see that in local color writing, which is sort of a contradiction to realism, but definitely shows love of place. We have some key regionalism writers, and we've already met Mark Twain, so we're going to start with somebody who mentored Mark Twain, Bret Harte. Doesn't he look like every Western character in every story probably that you've ever read or every Western you've watched? And that's because Bret Harte created almost all of those characters. If you like to watch Westerns, if your family likes to watch Westerns, old ones, new ones, you can thank this guy for creating just about every stereotype and stereotypical Western character. He was a journalist out east and went out west to kind of see what that whole new lifestyle was like. He became very, very famous, wrote up until the day he died for the Atlantic Monthly and many other magazines and publications, has numerous stories. He was a journalist, as I said before, a local color writer. He popularized those Western characters, and as we so much see in regionalism writers, the strongest regionalism writers were either in the South, or the West, or both. Now, we did have northern regional writers, we did have eastern regional writers, but the most prominent, the ones who still survive today, were writing about the South or the West, and that's probably because there were the most colorful characters in those areas. Well, then along comes little Mark Twain, who's probably just defected from the Civil War, and he meets up with Bret Harte, and they become buddies, and Bret Harte mentors him. Even though these pictures make Mark Twain look older, Bret Harte was actually much older than Mark Twain when they met, and he really got Mark Twain started in the field of journalism. He was, as we talked about last time, a political and social humorist. He also focused sometimes his writing on local color writing. He wrote novels and short stories, the most famous of which that we still talk about today is Huckleberry Finn, but he wrote quite a few others as well, novels and short stories. And again, he focused his writing on the South and on the West. But now, ladies, we have a woman entering the scene. We have it now. It's becoming more acceptable for women to be noticed in literature. And we have Kate Chopin, who was, no surprise, a women's rights activist. She also was a local color writer. She was born in Missouri, but when she got married, she traveled down to Louisiana with her husband. And after her husband died, she actually had to maintain the family, support her family with her writing, and support her children and her mother. And she did a famous job of it. She wrote many novels and short stories. The most famous that we still talk about today is called The Awakening, about a woman who has to determine whether or not the roles that society has provided for her are roles that she's willing to accept. And you'd have to read the novel to find out how that turns out. She focused most of her local color writing in the South. All right, once we get out of regionalism, we go to a much darker place. We focus on another type of writing during this time period was called naturalism. And we're not so much focusing on the wonderful diversity of our country as we are focusing on the terrible powerlessness of mankind. There's quite a difference. And this time period shares both of those very different perspectives. It's also a pretty minor representation of the types of writers that we had in America during that time. Naturalism as a philosophy, as an approach to writing, was a much more famous and usable philosophy in Europe. It was not widespread here. And there's a really good reason for that. It was just too doggone depressing and too doggone pessimistic. And we're Americans. We can do anything. We can rise above anything. We can overcome. And so not too many American writers embrace the naturalist perspective. But the ones who did, we're going to look at. Naturalism was really a response to the growing scientific world. Science was exploding. We were learning so much more about nature, so much more about psychology, so much more about sociology. And so in relation to that whole realism umbrella, naturalism took a really facts-only approach to life. Let's look at the facts only, look at life under a microscope, examine it, and see what we can determine. Now, a gentleman by the name of Charles Darwin had some great influence in this area. He influenced a lot of evolutionary, biological, and social theories during this time period, and he was a pretty stern guy there. He advocated, he along with many others advocated some sense of social reform because they saw that society was maybe going in a way it shouldn't be going. With the naturalism, kind of the key philosophies for naturalism include the concept that human nature is controlled by instinct, human nature is controlled by emotion, and or human nature is controlled by socio-economic conditions. The key word there is controlled by. Keywords, excuse me, is controlled by. That means that mankind is up against some pretty insurmountable odds. And if we sometimes are up against our instincts, they're going to win out. If we are sometimes up against social and economic conditions that are out of our control, we might fail. You can see where that would be a little bit depressing. The concept also in play is that the human animal is really unable to have ultimate control over its environment, that ultimately we are powerless in the face of society, in the face of nature, in the sake of economics. And I guess you can roll it all into one big philosophy that would be good for you to make sure you understand. It's the philosophy of determinism, that being that how you were born, where you were born, and the environment into which you were born influence your success or failure and shape your character really more than anything else. So basically, you can see where that really didn't have a huge appeal in America, because we're all about overcoming those difficulties. We're all about, hey, it doesn't matter where you're born, it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter where you come from, you can make it no matter what, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Naturalism didn't see life that way. In fact, naturalism said, you know what, if you just because you think you have free will doesn't mean you really do. It's all just an illusion. And there are bigger things in the world that control us, the natural world, the scientific world, and so on. The key naturalism writers include a gentleman by the name of Upton Sinclair, and he wrote a little book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. He was a grand political activist, and in fact, he enacted social change. A lot of these writers are great representation of how literature can affect history, and history can affect literature. It's a symbiotic relationship. He focused on the poor working conditions in the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and also the poor treatment of immigrants who came over to this country. He focuses, his big theme, his big conflicts are man versus society, and his main character, the protagonist in The Jungle, is ultimately powerless against what society throws at him. Similarly, Frank Norris wrote a novel called The Octopus. Now, The Octopus was not really about an octopus. It was about the railroad industry, and he wrote about its corruption. Again, another man versus society theme. And finally, this is a gentleman you might have heard of, Jack London. He wrote a book that you might be familiar with called Call of the Wild, and many, many others. He focused more on stories that put not necessarily man against society, but man against nature. That man is powerless, ultimately when he gets out into nature, or women gets out into nature, that there are just things that are beyond our control. And no matter what you do, you might die if you're stranded out in the cold and you're not able to build a fire. All right, that's the end of this lecture. A little bit shorter than the other ones. I hope that you are excited for the next one, because we are moving on to the 20th century and the Jazz Age and the Age of Flappers and parties. So stay tuned, and we'll catch you again in a little bit.